Hi, I'm Seán Duggan, and welcome to TheFIX, the podcast about Lightroom, Photoshop, post-processing, and the cool and creative things that we do with our images after the shoot. On today's show, we're going to get a little bit wet, metaphorically speaking, that is, as we dive under the surface of the ocean to talk about underwater photography and post-processing techniques for underwater photographs with our guest, Jason Bradley, a nature and underwater photographer based in Monterey, California. So grab your dive gear and join us for some undersea photographic exploration. So welcome back, and thank you as always for tuning in and joining us here on TheFIX. I do appreciate that. I'm really looking forward to this show today because it deals with a topic that I have some peripheral experience with because a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, I used to be a scuba diver and am familiar with that world and familiar with what it's like being under the ocean. And as a photographer, taking pictures under the water was always something I kind of wanted to do, but never quite got into it. So I'm really pleased to have Jason Bradley here with us to talk about today. How you doing, Jason?
I'm doing great, Seán. Thank you for the great introduction. Any introduction that references scuba diving and Star Wars is a perfect introduction, so thanks for that.
Yeah, there you go. Scuba diving and Star Wars. That's it.
Two best things.
So you live down in the Monterey area, right?
I do.
Yeah, and that's where I kind of started my diving. Well, I don't want to call it a diving career because it really wasn't a career, although I was a diver for a few years. But I lived in Santa Cruz at the time, and that's where I got certified and did, all of my diving down in Monterey and Pacific Grove and Carmel and Big Sur and all that. And I just really enjoyed that because I felt that as an average person, I'm not going to be traveling in outer space or orbiting the Earth on the International Space Station anytime soon. And I felt that as an average person, that was the closest I could get to the experience of being kind of in a totally different world.
That's it. Yeah. In fact, astronauts are trained in underwater environments to get the feeling of weightlessness. So you bet. If you want an alien environment, go underwater. Yeah. And arguably, depending on who you're talking to, even more so because we, the human race as we are, know a heck of a lot more about our own solar system than we do about the bottom of our own oceans. So the oceans truly are alien for us.
Yeah, and some of the creatures that they find down there with those deep sea submersibles, and they're shining their lights along, and this weird fish or strange crab creature comes by that they've never seen before, and it's just totally bizarre, and living down in this incredibly inhospitable, well, to our thinking, inhospitable environment with no light and very cold and totally dark.
You bet, which is why also in Monterey we have not only the Monterey Bay Aquarium, but the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, which shares the name with the Monterey Bay Aquarium, but that's about it. And what they do is deep sea research, and they're positioned in Moss Landing, I think strategically, because right off, a quarter mile offshore in Moss Landing, which, by the way, Moss Landing is halfway in between Santa Cruz and Monterey, kind of right in the middle of the crescent that makes up Monterey Bay, is one of the world's deepest undersea canyons. Bigger than the Grand Canyon. Its deepest point is 2.2 miles. And talk about strange and weird critters. That place is filled with them. Anopligasters, fangtooth, viperfish, weird things that you would see normally in a Ridley Scott alien movie or something like that. But yeah,
right. Or hanging out at the cantina in a Star Wars movie.
More Star Wars references. Good.
More Star Wars references. Yeah. We're scuba diving geeks and Star Wars geeks here.
Yes.
But the other thing about diving is that that sort of, for me anyway, called to mind that idea of being in a totally other world and an alien world is that, of course, you have to have a life support system with you in order to go and explore there, for any length of time. Obviously, you could do free diving for as long as you could hold your breath to a certain depth. But if you really want to go and explore at leisure, you do have to bring your air with you. So that was like a whole other dynamic that you have to deal with.
Yes, indeed. And of course, that means that our time is limited. Yeah, and if you're free diving, your time is very limited. And for scuba diving, or best case scenarios is we're down there for an hour or so. If you're on something like a rebreather, you can extend that time. But either way, yeah, we are limited with the amount of time that we're down there. We have to pay attention to what our gauges and what we're doing, and that's a distraction from the photography. And there's a lot to deal with underwater photography. As technical as the craft of photography, especially digital photography, is today, underwater digital photography is worse.
Well, yeah, and that brings up a great point, because when I was diving, and I went through, I guess the first level was open water diver, or again, I guess that's what it was, open water diver, and then I went to the next level, which was advanced open water diver. And we did, dives off of the coast of Big Sur where there was strong currents to deal with, and night dives, things like that. But I was already a photographer when I, started diving. And of course, naturally, I was very interested in taking pictures in that environment, because it's just so beautiful and fantastical, and the way the light streams down, through the surface of the water and gets diffracted and shining through the kelp and everything. So, but, I knew I wanted to get to a point where just dealing with the gear and the apparatus of diving sort of was second nature, because, you do have to be paying attention to, how deep you are, how much air supply you have, and, a myriad of other things just with your gear and your life support system, that I wanted to sort of get to a point where that was just totally second nature before I brought down the complexity of a camera system, because it's not just a camera. You have a camera in a housing, which complicates things further. You're wearing gloves. So that's really why I never reached the point of actually getting into photography, because a couple of years after I started diving, I actually went and lived in Europe for a while. And then when I came back, I didn't dive anymore. So that's why it's kind of interesting to talk to somebody like you, who have so much experience with the photographic part of diving.
Now, the irony of what you're talking about here is that photographers are notoriously poor divers. And I'm a perfect example of that. For example, one of the things that anybody's taught when they get into scuba diving is it's all about the buddy system. You got to stay with your buddy. If anything happens, you got that backup. Well, photographers typically do not do that. I most of the time will dive by myself. And it depends a little bit on how technical the dive is, but absolutely most of the time I'm diving by myself. I need to be focused on what I'm focusing on. I'll do things like holding my breath when I shouldn't be holding my breath, and there's a whole myriad of other things that make me say that I'm a poor diver, that they train you not to do. But basically what happens is I find that really cool critter underwater and I forget everything else, and I get focused on that. And we just get into photography mode is what happens.
Yeah.
But it is a good idea, absolutely, to get into, get your technical skills of scuba diving up to snuff enough to where, you can put them aside a little bit to focus on photography. But it's the irony of us underwater photographers. We put it all aside when we find that awesome critter underwater.
Well, and that's not really that much different from the way that photographers are above ground or above the water, because we've all experienced the situations where we get totally pulled in and distracted by something we're seeing, and we just have to go and photograph it, and we're just not that aware of what's going on around us. So that's really not that much different. So you operate a business called Bradley Photographic Services, which offers printing services to photographers. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I don't just do underwater photography. I'm a jack of all trades kind of guy, really. And yeah, one of the things that I do to earn my living, which it's kind of an accident how I got into it, honestly, is offer print services. And it's not something I've been advertising. I've been doing it for a little under 3 years now. It's been a word of mouth business. And I've purposely not advertised it because honestly, I'd be overwhelmed if I did, I think, because I'm just running it myself. I'm pretty busy with it as it is. But I have just to my side here in this studio, I have a 7900 Epson, but I also work with an Epson 11880 and 9900, and the guy that I print with, Rick Forcino, also recently bought a solvent printer, one of these beautiful new Epson solvent printers, because we do canvas wraps as well. We, of course, work with a myriad of different papers, luster papers, metallic papers, gold fiber silk, Canson platine, fiber rags, some traditional photo papers, but in addition to that, we'll do canvases as well. But prior to the solvent printer, we would do canvases like anybody else would, run it through the Epson printer with aqueous inks, and we'd laminate it and wrap it, and off you go. But with the new solvent inks, you don't need to laminate them at all. And I have to say, the colors that are coming out of them on the canvases are coming out absolutely more vibrant than anything we were seeing on the aqueous inks as well. So
fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, all kinds of different printers, all kinds of different sizes, all kinds of different papers, and absolutely, because me being a jack of all trades, I also will get into probably talking about Lightroom in my book and all that. I also work with a lot of photographers in helping them develop their images and helping them maximize the potential, the quality of their work while making a print. So consulting a lot as well.
Yeah, and so you just mentioned, something else that you're doing. You have a book that's going to be coming out soon. Tell us a little bit about that.
It is a book going to be coming out through Focal Press, and it's called Creative Workflow in Lightroom. And I like to call it a back to basics book on Lightroom. I've been teaching workshops in Lightroom workflow for years. I was teaching workflow workshops before Lightroom came out, working with Bridge and Photoshop and such. But in a nutshell, one of the things that I've found over the years, and there's some great books on the market. Kelby's books are great. Victoria Bampton's book is fantastic, who you had on a few weeks ago, and so on. And I always have clients coming to me who have these books and read these books, but still lack a fundamental understanding of why they're doing some of the things that they do. So when I say a back to basics approach, it's showing people how to keyword, but why does a photographer annotate an image? Why is it important to do that? Yes, I can point to the tools and to the tools to use in the develop module on Lightroom, but there absolutely should be a fundamental understanding of what raw files are and what raw workflow is, how to approach a development through first understanding what the subject and narrative of your photo is. Because if you don't know that, how can you dodge and burn? How can you redirect a viewer's attention to the central part of the photograph? So it's not enough to just say, here is a localized correction tool. You have to also tell the photographer that the reason why you want to use a localized correction tool is to redirect your audience's attention to, the subject of your photograph, what you want them to see. So it's a back to basics approach of Lightroom and workflow. And I talk about managing your work, developing your work, and sharing your work through exporting and printing.
And when is that book due to hit the shelves of a bookstore near you?
Well, that is the magic question. It's in the production phase right now with Focal Press. It is available already for pre-sale on Amazon. And the Amazon date says toward the end of next month. And we're trying very hard to make that happen. But as we speak, Focal Press is literally formatting it and designing it. So hopefully that will all be done and ready to go by that time.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll put a link to that the Amazon page for that in the show notes for people who are interested in checking that out. So I look forward to seeing that. And so another thing that you're active in, and this is sort of like a nice segue for getting back into our primary topic of underwater photography and processing underwater photos, is that you also lead workshops as well. And I know you have one coming up in a couple weeks now. Actually, by the time this show airs, it'll probably be about 10 days down at the Channel Islands. Is that right?
Yeah. Every year I go to the Channel Islands. This particular trip will be out of Santa Barbara with the group TWiP Aquatics. TWiP Aquatics has 3 different dive boats, live-aboard dive boats. A live-aboard vessel is one that you obviously live on for a period of time. And we're going to be out in the Channel Islands, specifically the southern Channel Islands, which consists of, well, we're going to target Santa Barbara Island and San Clemente Island. Hopefully we'll spend a day on the oil rigs as well. Everything is always weather dependent.
Of course.
But the southern Channel Islands is where I like to go every year. The kelp is richer there. The water is usually clear. It's certainly warmer, but I prefer that. In the northern Channel Islands, the water can actually be much colder and greener and more akin to what I'm used to diving here in Monterey. So the southern Channel Islands for me is a bit of an escape from the norm here in Monterey. But yeah, we'll be down there for 4 days. I'll be facilitating with one of my idols, Chuck Davis, who's a wonderful black and white photographer and a cinematographer, underwater cinematographer. Got to start back in the day working with Jacques Cousteau on the Calypso.
Wow.
So that'll be a lot of fun. And we're going to, speaking of printing, we're going to be focusing on printing, which is new for me. I've never been on a boat for 4 days trying to run a printing workshop, but I have a bit of a fire under me right now to talk to more and more photographers about printing. It's not just because I'm running a print business. Like I said, I'm doing it as a word of mouth business right now, but I actually believe that printing is a very important part of a photographer's workflow. And I noticed that less photographers are printing than ever before. So I'm trying to evangelize this part of the workflow right now. And yes, I want to get underwater photographers more into printing. I think it's important.
So are you going to have a printer on the boat?
No, we're not. But what we're going to do is we're going to have everybody bring a print, and we're going to have a print discussion critique session, I guess, talking about everybody's prints that they brought. And then Chuck's going to talk about his analog printing processes. He still shoots film. And then I'm going to talk about digital print workflow. And I'm going to bring a bunch of samples of different types of paper and mediums, not only photographic papers, but, mounting and printing on aluminum, canvases, all kinds of stuff to, show people, what the different mediums are available.
Right. And so, so when you're photographing underwater, actually, before I ask that question, let me just, since this workshop is coming up, are there any open spaces?
For this one, there is, yes. We have, the dates are November 14th to the 17th. There are still some spaces available, and you can find more information about it on my website. I think you'll put a link up for that where you can.
Right. Yeah. No. We'll definitely put a little banner across the bottom of the screen there with your website link, and we'll also have it as a clickable link.
I should also mention that for the underwater stuff, I do partner up with wetpixel.com for that. So this particular Channel Islands trip is a Bradley Photographic / wetpixel trip. Wetpixel is a well-known portal for underwater photographers to all things underwater photography on the internet, and they have a wonderful forum out there for sharing your thoughts and questions with the underwater photo community, which is owned by Eric Chang, who was on another This Week in Photography episode a week ago or so, talking about drones. Eric
I saw that.
Eric was the outreach director of photography for DJI for a period of time. So he's also connected to WebPixel as well. So in addition to the Channel Islands trip, I have a trip going to Socorro Islands, south of Cabo San Lucas next June, and lots of other stuff planned for the next couple of years. So, yeah.
So what sort of gear are you shooting with when you're going out? And do you use certain gear for some situations and other gear for other scenarios?
Well, I happen to have my housing right here. This is right here. This is mainly what I use. This is my workhorse. And this is a Nauticam housing for a Nikon D810. 10. And yeah, so this is mainly what I use. I say mainly because I also do have this housing here, this little guy. This is a Nauticam housing for a Sony RX100 Mark II. This is more of my toy thing. So if I'm down there shooting with this, and this big bubble on the front of it, this dome port is also called a fisheye dome port, is used for wide angle photography. And 95% of the time I'm shooting wide angle. It's what I like to do. But yes, sometimes I'm down there and I say, dang it, I wish I had my macro lens with me, my macro camera or macro something. So I do have the opportunity to have something small like this where I can clip off to my VC. So if I see that thing that I just don't want to miss, I won't miss it. But this is mainly what I do. And this housing, I mentioned this is a Nauticam housing. There's many different manufacturers out there. And most of them will make a housing for this camera. There's Nauticam, there's CNC, there's Aquatica, there's Icolite, and they all make housings for Nikon cameras and for Canon cameras and other cameras as well. They're all specifically designed for a specific camera, and all of the buttons that are on your camera are accessible. As you can see, all those little buttons there, all the buttons on your camera are accessible through the housing. So I have full access to any of the stuff that I want to play with my camera.
And how cumbersome is it to operate those buttons with the diver gloves on? Because, I mean, obviously the neoprene is fairly thin and stuff like that, but it's still, it's another barrier between your finger and what you're trying to manipulate.
And they're not necessarily thin, because there's warm water diving and then there's cold water diving. People dive in the tropics, but there's also divers that will dive in Antarctica under ice. I haven't done that yet, but I've absolutely done a lot of diving in British Columbia and Alaska. And when I'm there, I'm wearing thick 5 to 7 millimeter gloves. But even with that, I don't have any problem hitting the buttons or using the dials or anything like that. These are really big. This right here is the shutter release. That's a pretty big button here that even if I have a 7 millimeter thick neoprene glove on, I have no problem doing that. This big dial here is for aperture and everything. As you can see, I'm not even letting go of the handle here. I'm able to hit with my thumb or my index finger. So it's pretty easy, actually. Not too bad.
Okay. Yeah, and that big bubble on the front of the housing that you're shooting through, that doesn't interfere with the camera's autofocus at all. If there's any, reflection or glare on that, it doesn't. Have you ever had it get confused by that?
Yeah, there are problems, and the industry makes acrylic domes, and then there's glass domes, and there's one manufacturer that will even coat their glass dome. Some people love that and some people don't. But I've exclusively used for all of my career acrylic domes. One of the things, though, that I do notice with my acrylic dome is if I'm pointing up to the light, I will see some reflection of, let me grab my housing back here. Inside here, you can see that there's a hole where the lens kind of looks through. The rim of that hole will reflect back into the dome if it's pointing up into the light. That can get annoying. So you have to kind of learn to work around that sometimes. Sometimes you just can't, because that's where your animal is, and then you got to play with it in Photoshop to get rid of it and such. But yeah, you do. And your camera does focus differently underwater as well. But that's a whole other discussion on how an underwater camera focuses versus a camera above water. But yeah.
So, in getting to the types of photographs that you make when you're underwater, obviously that's going to depend on, whether it's for a particular assignment or anything like that. But, I've noticed in the past, I guess 10 years or so is when I first noticed it. I first started seeing underwater pictures photographed in the ocean that were being displayed as black and white images. And before that, I really don't wasn't really that conscious of seeing a lot of black and white, under ocean photography. And, you provided some really beautiful, exquisite black and white images that you've taken underwater. So can you speak to that, that sort of decision, or what motivated you to process your images as black and white and present them as black and white?
Well, I love this question because I'm very much into, well, let me back up a second. I think it's safe to say that photographers, artists, if you will, whether they're shooting underwater, above water, assignment work, not assignment work, whatever, go through phases in their career where they are engaged in what they're doing and then not so engaged. Feel creative during phases of what they're doing, and then have phases where they don't feel creative. Recently, I went through one of these kind of phases where I was not connecting with my work as much as I had been over the years, and I had no idea why. And it was very frustrating for me. It affected my productivity. Over time, I figured out, and I was talking to a lot of colleagues. I think what helped me most is I did a workshop actually with, I think these guys, Ted Orland and David Bales, authors of a fantastic book, Art and Fear, which I think every photographer should read.
Excellent book. I hardly agree with you.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful book. It talks about, well, what I'm talking about here, the obstacles that we all face through our lives in the process of making art and being creative. Anyway, through that workshop, I kind of started to figure out a new direction for how to look or engage my work. In a nutshell, I became just utterly sick of working in color with underwater photography. If you go to my website, you'll still see today that most of the stuff on there is color photography. And as somebody who's trying to make a living selling a lot of underwater photographs, there's not much of a market for fine art, black and white stuff. So I was just compelled through making money to stick with, got to do color, got to do that. But creatively, it was just bored with it. I was tired of looking at it. And so I switched gears. I said, to heck with it, to heck with making money, to heck with submissions, to heck with all of it, all the things that were obstacles for me. I just kind of let them all go. And I decided to do what I wanted to do on my own terms. And I was shooting black and white, and these days, mostly ambient light photography, meaning these, I showed you my housing before, but these are strobes, by the way, underwater strobes. So if I want to light something underwater, this big Canon is what I take with me. And I turned those off, and I decided to shoot mostly ambient light and focus instead of documenting the cool shark or the cool fish or the cool thing with color, is to instead look at shapes and textures and tonality and patterns and things that kind of, well, I connected with more because they did a better job at translating the feeling that I had when diving underwater. Just taking a quick snapshot or documentary photo of a shark that swims by was a good idea if I wanted to sell the photo, but it didn't translate the feeling that I was having underwater as much as what I'm able to do with black and white photography, focusing on shapes and textures and patterns and tonality. So I'm happy doing it. I'm happy shooting black and white. On
a more conceptual level, I find the black and white interpretations to be a lot more fascinating than the color ones. Not that there are not beautiful and effective and fascinating color photographs taken underwater, but just for my own personal aesthetic, I really am drawn to that way of seeing that realm.
Yeah. Well, I'll say one more thing on this, and before I do, I want to also point out that this phase that I'm in, I have certainly not eliminated color photography from what I do. I'm just doing it differently now. I appreciate it in a different way. Actually, looking at things through the monochromatic filter that I'm looking through right now has helped me kind of re-engage what I'm doing in color in this different way. But I'm still trying to figure it out, even though I did that workshop with Ted and David and helped me quite a bit. And I'm feeling creative again. I'm passionate about the photos that I'm doing again. I'm still trying to figure out why black and white, why this new look. And one of the things that has come to mind here's one of the ways that I try and explain it is one of the things that I find most beautiful when diving anywhere underwater is being in front of a giant school of fish. It's mesmerizing. A giant school of fish. It's, thousands and thousands of thousands of fish that are moving together cooperatively, and light sparkles off them and it captures your eye. And it's this group of animals that are working together in this choreography and this dance that mimics a single organism in a way that you just don't see anywhere else in the world. But when I'm seeing that, and when I'm talking about it, I'm talking about the choreography of it and how it sparkles and how they move together and the cooperativeness of it. None of that has anything to do with color. So when I'm taking a color photograph of it, and I'm worrying about color when I'm developing the image, and should I have it more blue or less blue, or what I'm doing, that to me is distracting from the essence of what I'm trying to interpret with the photograph. Because again, the feeling I'm left with has nothing to do with color. So for me, eliminating color out of it altogether, I'm able to focus on the things that matter. And I said some of them before, patterns, textures, shapes, tonalities, but most of what I'm doing underwater has very little to do with color and has a lot more to do with other things.
Yeah, interesting. So you have some tips for processing underwater photography that you were going to share with us, I believe, right?
Yes, and they're all color photographs.
They're all color. Well, don't worry, we will have some of your black and white work up on the page, and people will be able to see it there, and they'll have seen it earlier when we were discussing your black and white work. We'll put some in there, so that people can see that. So why don't you go ahead and share your screen?
Okay, will do. So what I'd like to do here is talk about a few very common scenarios for what we underwater photographers deal with when developing our images, bringing our images into Lightroom. And the first one is making sure that we have good color in our images, not necessarily a white balance that's accurate, but good color that interprets what we saw as best as possible. And one of the things that underwater photographers have to deal with is the color of the water column itself. And ocean water can come back to us in different colors. Most of your viewers might think, well, the ocean is blue. Well, in fact, it's only blue in some places. In a lot of places, it's blue-green or very green or rich saturated green. Cold water environments tend to be really rich with plankton, phytoplankton, which are microscopic plants that turn the water green, while tropical environments that don't have as nutrient-rich water, they tend to be more blue. This image here, for example, is shot in the Channel Islands. And the visibility is pretty good here in this image. Therefore, the water doesn't have a lot of phytoplankton in it and is blue. But we can play with this if we want it a little bit more blue or a little bit less blue without affecting the rest of the photo. And the key tool to doing that with having your blue water blue or your green water green is the HSL panel. Specifically, to go to your hue section of the HSL panel, what I do is I click on my target adjustment tool, turn my cursor into the crosshair, and just click right on the water and move it in one direction or the other, up or down, to dial in that color exactly the way I want it. And if you notice, the fish, some of the fish are not being affected at all, while some of them are just slightly shifting color if they're blue. Here's another example here with the jellyfish. This water happens to be more greenish, blue-greenish. In this particular image, I do want this water to be more blue. So I'll click on the water right above the jellyfish and move it up and down.
Oh yeah, that looks nice.
Look at that. So that went from kind of a blah blue-green color to something that feels a lot more ocean-like, nice, rich blue color.
And so is that, so the greenish color of the water, that was the sort of as shot out of camera result for that image?
Well, as shot out of camera, and then brought into Lightroom, and then hit with the Adobe standard color profile.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, there's always some interpretation with a raw file.
Absolutely. And since you asked me that question, and I brought up Adobe standard, what I found with underwater photographers that shoot Nikon versus Canon is the Adobe standard color profile tends to shift the color of Nikon files quite a bit, while Canon files, when shifted to the Adobe standard, you don't see a lot of shift in color. And the color with images that are taken in blue water with Nikon cameras shift noticeably. So with the Adobe standard, it was that color.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah, that's an aspect of raw files that a lot of people don't really understand, that actually under the hood, a raw file is actually a grayscale image. And there always has to be some amount of interpretation to even just sort of see a preview to start working with it.
Yes, and to visualize that, we can choose their profiles by going to the camera calibration panel, opening this up, and camera standard selected now. Boy, do we have a lot here, but the reason why I'm seeing a lot versus what your viewers might be seeing, my guess is they'll see less than this, is because I have a D2X Nikon in the mix, and we have a lot more available in there as a result of that. But usually what you see is Adobe standard, camera vivid, camera portrait, and then behind the scenes are all the choices for all of the different cameras that Adobe has created. But here is where we can create that or find that profile if we want.
Yeah.
So we digress.
Let me ask you a question about, since we were just talking about color and the color of the water and stuff like that, let me ask you a question about white balance. When you're shooting underwater, are you setting a specific white balance on the camera? Now, obviously, if you were shooting with a strobe, maybe you're going to set it to flash white balance. But if you're shooting ambient light, which I know you're doing a lot of these days, are you doing auto white balance, or are you setting a specific white balance preset?
I just set it on an auto white balance, and I found that the color is fine and consistent with the cameras that I use. So I just leave it on auto white balance. However, if you are using a strobe underwater, you putting it on flash or even daylight is also just fine. Each of those results, I think, are good and consistent. But for me, auto white balance seems to work well. So I just leave it on there. I certainly don't do anything, and I don't know many, if any, still photographers that do try and get accurate color underwater, where they're bringing grayscales or X-Rite color passports underwater or anything. So auto white balance is good enough, and then interpret the color the best you can using your white balance selector and tint sliders and so on.
Right. So, and obviously, there's not a lot of probably neutral gray objects under the water, although there may be some rocks. And I see you have a picture there down in your film strip that looks like a shark.
Well, yeah, it depends on what you're shooting. The image here that's up on the screen, the jellyfish, there's not a lot of neutral color here, although arguably I can find maybe something in the frills of the jellyfish that would work. But yes, for example, here, a shark or a whale or a dolphin, or there's actually quite a lot of marine critters that do have neutral tones inherent in them. And a shark is a perfect example of that. All right, so if I take my white balance selector and just place it somewhere over the shark, all right, here you can see, and just putting the white balance selector on a part of the shark here, looking at the preview in the navigator panel, we get a pretty good color. Let me click on that here. That's simple.
Yeah,
so it's
much better.
Absolutely. So it just depends on what you're shooting, but some images don't have the neutral thing, and some images are pretty easy to deal with. So stick to big pelagic animals like sharks, dolphins, whales, and things like that, and your life will be much easier with white balance for sure.
So what type of a shark is that?
This is a tiger shark, actually. Yes, we do cageless tiger shark diving in the Bahamas from time to time. This one I'd say is a medium-sized tiger shark, but we absolutely will swim with big ones. And I say big ones like, 13-foot plus 15-foot tiger sharks. There's actually a tiger shark, also, since you asked the question, that's pretty famous with underwater photographers because she's, for lack of a better word, known as a friendly tiger shark, and her name is Emma. In fact, she has her own Facebook page.
So I'll have to look that up.
You do have to look that up. Emma is a friendly 15-foot female tiger shark that that socializes with divers that swim with her. And this is around the Nassau area, and their place called, it's actually named Tiger Beach. It's famous for swimming with these guys. And you swim with other sharks there, reef sharks and lemon sharks, but tigers are absolutely the draw of that part of the world. But fun stuff.
As a species, are they just not as aggressive towards divers? Is that the reason that you're able to do that?
I think the term aggressive with sharks it's a very poor term. Sharks being aggressive and dangerous is mostly a myth. They get a lot of hype because, well, they're big, toothy apex predator, look like monsters sort of things, so they make good news stories. But if you've been following the news, one of the things you might have read lately is teenagers with cell phones that are texting are now officially more dangerous than sharks.
Yes, I did see that. Yeah, and actually there was a This Week in Photo show on that, Death by Selfie, a few weeks back.
Yes, death by selfie. Well, and in the ocean too, you have a far greater risk of getting killed by jellyfish and all kinds of other animals than you do by sharks. Jellyfish kill far more people than sharks do every year, but sharks get all the hype. So I should also say, when you're underwater with them, the reason why we're afraid of shark, obviously, is because there's the predator-prey relationship. Do they want to eat us? And as soon as you get underwater with them and you're eye level with them, as we are in this image here, you get right away that sharks do not see you as food. So the fear factor goes away. And their behavior, for the most part, is predictable. You can see what they're interested in, where they're going, and what they're doing. That does not mean that you should have your guard down. I think you should treat a shark and any wild animal with a fair amount of caution. If you see a strange dog walking across the street, you're not going to run up to it and stick your hand in its mouth. You're going to, you're going to pace yourself a little bit. You should do that with sharks underwater as well. But the fear factor goes away. These animals are not aggressive. And Emma, for example, I would say she is obviously interested in socializing with a lot of divers as well. So
interesting. Yeah. Well, I'm definitely going to have to look up Emma's Facebook page. I'll put a link to that in the show notes too.
do. Yes. And Emma needs a bigger following.
Right. So speaking of jellyfish, I see you also have some jellyfish images there.
I do. So it's easy to get off topics of developing when dealing with cool critters like this. But in addition to fixing color underwater, one common thing to play with is the clarity of underwater photographs, because we don't always get crystal clear 80-foot visibility underwater. Water can have very poor visibility, and more times than not, it can be very hazy. So actually, one of my new favorite tools, I know there's not a lot of fans of the new updates with Lightroom, but one of the tools that has been brought to us with the new updates is the dehaze slider. And with the newest one that was so controversial, it did bring us the dehaze slider with localized correction. I love the dehaze slider. And the reason why is because, well, images like this that look hazy underwater, that are shot with just ambient light, can be fixed very easily with it. Very, very easily. So, for example, just a little bit.
And just to clarify for people watching, and also for people listening to the audio version, the dehaze slider for doing the overall effects to the image is found down in the effects panel.
Correct. So here in the effects panel, and just a little bit, like I said, goes a long way. But in addition to the dehaze slider being an effects panel that does localized correction, like I mentioned, we can also come up to a localized correction. And right here now with the 6.2 release, that's given us the dehaze slider for localized correction. So if I move that over to the right just a little bit, I can take now, say, a graduated filter. Of course, you do with adjustment brush or radial filter. And that looks weird, but we'll back it off a little bit. And
yeah, no, it does. Locally. Yeah, it does help a lot.
Yeah,
it's great for, as you probably know this, it's great for night photography as well, and also for auroras, the aurora borealis. It's really effective on those.
Yes, absolutely. And you have a lot of aurora pictures, I've noticed. So you've played with that with your aurora pictures, yes?
Yeah. It's as with any sort of control like that, it's also similar to clarity. You can definitely overdo it because it does tend to punch up the contrast and the color saturation a bit, and it sort of makes the colors a little bit more apparent. So you can go too far, but it definitely is very effective with night photography and auroras specifically.
Yes. And since you mentioned that, one of the things I like about the dehaze filter is, for some reason with underwater photographers, this seems to be a controversial slider. I've noticed a lot of people have commented on the fact that they don't like it, which to me is always a funny thing with tools, to say you don't like a tool for a particular reason or another, because tools work with some photos and they don't work with other photos. I don't like the dehaze filter for all of my underwater photos, but for these, I think they work fantastic. It's called a dehaze slider, but that doesn't mean that's all it does is by adding or subtracting haze. After talking to Eric Chan recently, who's an engineer for the develop module at Adobe, he explained to me that what the dehaze filter is doing is it's an adaptive mix of the black slider, the clarity slider, and the saturation slider. So since you pointed out that playing with Aurora punches up colors a little bit, yes, you do have a lot. Do have a lot of control with mid-tone contrast with the dehaze slider. Think of it as a contrast tool, but unlike playing with mid-tone contrast with tone curves, it does bump up color quite a bit too. So you can balance that by just moving your saturation slider down a little bit if you need to.
Right. Yeah. And that's what I do a lot of times with the Aurora pictures. If I like the overall contrast effect that it gives me, but I feel that it's kind of amping the color up too much, I just sort of dial it down with the saturation.
But here's one more jellyfish example. So here's before, and just a little bit of increase. World of difference to me.
Yeah.
So I love this thing. So my suggestion to underwater photographers, if you are certainly one of these ones that don't like it or don't know how to use it yet, start playing with it with your images that have a lot of ambient light associated with them. You'll find that it does a really good job with those images. So
do me a favor, Jason. I'd really like to see this one in black and white, since you showed some really beautiful black and white underwater images earlier. This one strikes me, because this one's pretty much monochromatic.
Yes.
Although very green, it strikes me that this would be really interesting looking in black and white.
Well, I would be happy to, for obvious reasons, since I like black and white photography so much right now. But and this, since you suggested that, putting this in black and white speaks to exactly what I was talking about before, of shutting off the color allows me to now zero in on the texture and pattern of this image. And that now translates, I think, the feeling of what I was looking at underwater a lot more than the color image was. So
Yeah, no, it looks really cool in black and white, very
Yeah.
ethereal and almost ghostly with those guys.
And you could, and since you turn the color off, as we just mentioned, dehaze sliders play with color. You can get a little crazier with that dehaze slider with black and white images as opposed to color images. So you can see I bump that dehaze slider up to 75 now, and it holds together, I think, just fine. So
yeah,
cool.
No, that looks really cool in black and white.
Yeah. All right. Well, dehazing, we got color, we got dehazing, and then probably one of the most common things we underwater photographers have to deal with is not giant Pacific octopus. That's a more rare thing. But if we zoom into this or look at this giant Pacific octopus image in a one-to-one view, you can see something that's typical with us photographers in that we have spots on our sensor on here. But with underwater photography, we have all of these other dots floating in the water. And this is just particulate, or as we call it, stuff that floats in the water that shows up in your image here. And some of it you can minimize with strobe placement, but depending on how much is floating in the water, you just can't get rid of it. And the strobes that you're using will light them up regardless of their position, and they shine back in the camera, and that's called backscatter. It's a very common thing that underwater photographers deal with, and it certainly annoys us quite a bit. So an easy way to deal with it, obviously, is the same way we deal with sensor spots, and that's go to your spot removal tool, clicking on this icon here, or hit the Q key as your quick key. And the same way we can get rid of sensor spots is the same way we can get rid of backscatter. Although sensor spots is usually only 2 or 3 of those in your frame, while backscatter there can be, as you can see, many, 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 many dots. So finding out which ones you should get rid of can be tedious. What I suggest to do is take the tool a bit further, come down here to your toolbar and hit visualize spots, or quick key A. And then what happens is this. You get this edges view of your photo, and all of these spots are easily highlighted for you. You can dial in with your threshold slider how many or how few you see. And what's appropriate for that is best done by setting it to a position, turning this off, and seeing if this matches what you see in your image. That looks like the visualize spots filter is showing us a little too much. So I'll bring it back down to this position. And then from here, then we'll just spot very easily as we go.
But still obviously, since there are so many of those, it's still quite a tedious undertaking. You have to get into a Zen frame of mind when you're doing that.
Yes, this is where glasses of wine and music in the background does help. But it absolutely all depends on how much this stuff drives you crazy, how much obsessive compulsive tendencies you do have. I suggest to the underwater photographers listening to this to don't worry about eliminating all of the backscatter. Backscatter is not necessarily a bad thing. There are many underwater photographers that will obsess about this. I do not. What I tend to do is I'll eliminate or get rid of the backscatter on the water that I find distracting from the image. And that's not all of the backscatter. That's the big chunks, the stuff that will move me away from looking at the eye of the animal or something else. And that's about it. I also have to say too that backscatter, since it is looked at so negatively in underwater photography, that it doesn't always have to be. Backscatter can be sometimes used as a compositional tool as well. There's some images that I do where I shot the image at night, where I have a black background, for example. I'll purposely incorporate backscatter into the image or particulate to where stuff around the animal might then show up as, something that looks akin to stars. I think backscatter can be beautiful if it's done correctly. So play with it if it's distracting and then move on.
And so just to clarify for people listening, you're only really going to see backscatter if you're shooting with a strobe. Is that correct?
Well, That's technically the case, but that doesn't mean you won't see particulate floating in the water if you're not shooting with the strobe. So yes, the term backscatter refers to your strobe lighting up the water column and the particulate being lit up and then reflected back to you.
I see. Okay, great. No, those are really excellent tips, and you've sort of.
I should mention one more thing: is the name of probably the largest store for selling underwater photographic gear in the world, and they're located here in Monterey, just down the street from me, and was nice enough to loan me this housing that I showed you earlier, so I can show it off. But
cool.
If people are interested in looking at some of these toys, I highly suggest checking out Backscatter.com as well.
Oh, that's the name, Backscatter.com, huh?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'll put that in the show notes as well. Well, that was really cool, Jason. Thank you very much. Great tips for processing underwater photos, and you've whetted my appetite, no pun intended, for perhaps getting back and diving again after more than 20 years. It's been a while.
Well, anytime you want to do cageless tiger shark diving, you let me know.
Great, right? Well, I have to develop a relationship with Emma and meet her.
You'll be my chum. Haha, get it?
There we go. There we go. Yes,
my buddy.
Here's my chum. So, Jason, tell people out there in the ocean of the internet where they can find you on the web.
Well, bradleyphotographic.com is the place to find me, and really everything we talked about can be found there, from the print services to the workshops to the shark photos and all that stuff.
Great. Okay. And so you have coming up in about 10 days from when this show is going to air, you've got the Channel Islands workshop, which is being offered off that dive boat. And are any spots left available for those, for last minute spontaneous photographers?
Yes, there are a few spots still left. So give me a shout, send me an email. If you're interested, you can also go to truthaquatics.com. That's where you sign up for the trip officially. But there are a few spots still left, yes. Okay, and I assume there's probably a link to that from your website as well, anyway. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and then you also have a night photography and light painting workshop coming up early next year, right, in Joshua Tree? I do. So although we've talked a lot about underwater photography and sharks and jellyfish and stuff, I do work with a lot of surface dwellers as well. So I do lead workshops that are above water, and this March I do have one. This is the third one I've done in Joshua Tree National Park that has a focus on night photography and light painting. And boy, is it a fun place to do that. I found, because even if the conditions are poor, there's tons to photograph in Joshua Tree National Park because there's so much light coming in or bleeding in from the Palm Springs area. I have to say, unfortunately, that workshop is full, with all that said. But I'll be doing another one the following year, more than likely. And I do have other workshops for surface dwellers coming to Big Sur area, southern and northern Big Sur, later in the year. So keep an eye out for those. Great. Excellent. Cool. All right. Well, thanks again for stopping by. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure that the viewers and listeners did as well. Good. Well, thanks, Sean, for having me. I really appreciate it, and hope to see you underwater soon. Okay. All right. All right. Well, that's this week's episode of TheFIX. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you for tuning in, as always. Remember that in addition to seeing the video version of the show on the website at thisweekinphoto.com/TheFIX, you can also subscribe to the audio version on iTunes. So we'll see you next week on TheFIX.